Chapter 22. Butcher. I waited until she was at the top of the stairs, nothing showing but her shoes, before I sprang off the couch and went after her, staying back, out of sight. I needed her. I needed her to take more, so much more. Every bite of her. Baking made me want her more. It shouldn't work that way, but it wasn't the baking I wanted but Violetta. This wasn't how it was supposed to work, her burying the girl so she could be my baker, but how could I say no? Landry would follow her, the other bakers would follow Landry, and my father would require me to make my baker happy just like he had to make his. I followed her, staying back, aware of the confused look of Calder students when they saw her, a baker walking through the halls like he owned them, as Cesario, even more determined and in control than she'd been as Sebastian. Watched her, shadowing her until she left and Landry took her away. I stood there in the doorway watching her go with him, never once glancing back. Landry did. He stood by the passenger's door of his blue beater, opening the door for her, and looked at me. His look something angry and pleased at the same time. I fell back and turned, almost running into Francis. By his grin, he'd witnessed the whole thing. Well, Butcher, this was an interesting day, don't you think? Did you notice? Lunch had shrimp and duck. Who decides these things? I grabbed his neck and dragged him into a room where I could pace and run my hands through my hair. I hadn't seen her hair. Maybe she'd shaved it all off. She would look adorable bald like a mischievous fairy girl. So you have a baker again? I scowled at him. Apparently. Did you know about this? Did you put her up to it? You mean him, right? No, I didn't tell Cesario to dress like a boy because that would somehow make you forget that you're in love with her. I did watch the whole thing. She was masterful. She should be a CM manipulating a stubborn butcher like you. It was sweet. I licked my lips because the flavor of her bread was still on them, but it wasn't anything as sweet as her. She's angry at me. He laughed and patted my shoulder. Furious. When she took only a tiny bit of your energy, you should have seen your face. She's torturing you. I stared at his broad grin. I'm glad that makes you so happy. He shrugged. Somebody's got to do it. We're too nervous that you'll make us the butcher after you to really push you. Sebastian should be the one heckling you, getting you off the couch, but he slinks around fetching your slippers instead. He's adorable. So the question is, now what? I stared at him. What? He started ticking things off his fingers. The seals which have to all be rebroken and recast and sealed. The monster vampire butcher who eats werewolves has to be found again and defeated this time, and probably something about bringing order back to the city after the whole infestation of werewolves thing. Is that all? He shrugged. I'm not the CM. I don't know. Maybe you'd have something on there about making Cesario happy. I gritted my teeth. Can I make her happy? He shrugged. You're her butcher, she's your baker. Making her happy is what you're supposed to do. Maybe you can make her a custom pin with metal studs. I sighed but headed to the armory. I had a knife to fix, seals to figure out, and if the smith didn't have ideas, I'd have to talk to my dad. I'd rather not do that. I'd done about as much research as I could though. I stopped and headed to the garage instead. Changing direction all the time, headed one way, and then going off in another one. I wasn't used to that, changing my mind. Not a butcher thing. I had too much energy. I should go on the north side and try to find something to kill, but it wasn't dark yet. Maybe if I was at Candlestick, she'd tell me she needed more of my energy. My heart pounded faster and faster until I broke into a run. I'd never felt anything so painful. Her touching me without letting me touch her, taking so little energy that I was only left with a craving for more. I drove to Candlestick so quickly I made it before Landry. The CM was in his office. I threw my rusty knife on the map he was studying, with a frown on his face. Orion, have a seat. I paced, running a hand through my hair. I need to talk about casting. He looked up, a glint in his eyes that I'd never wanted to see. Do you? Don't usually cast knives. Not when the smith at Calder is so capable. I don't want to step on anyone's toes. I snorted. Except mine. We need to put up temporary seals somehow while we break down the others so that this time we don't have a huge surge of nightmares to deal with. We're still dealing with All Hallows surge. Temporary seals? That's an idea. I crossed my arms and forced myself to focus on my father instead of glancing out the window in search of Violetta. Strange, isn't it? He smiled brightly and picked up the knife, eyeing the edge. You don't usually neglect your weapons. I would say never before this moment. I shrugged and paced closer to the window so I could look out at the driveway. Was that Landry's car? I watched it crawl up the drive towards the garage. Only saw a flash of Violetta, all in black, her black cap pulled low, but seeing her made it a little easier to breathe. Orion, I know that you've been reluctant to learn anything about the making, but I think you'll like it. It's a good way to channel energy when you have too much. I glanced at him. She's staying here. Do you have any problem with that, even if we're not going to continue the Daughtry name for you? He laughed and shook his head. She's Landry's daughter. This is Landry's home. She'll have a place here whatever she wears or name she uses. Even if she wasn't, she's a great baker and an amazing woman. She's decided that. She's your baker. Are you arguing with that? I ran a hand through my hair. I should cut it off. How can I? She threatened me, said she'd lead a revolt of all the bakers if I didn't accept her bread and give her my energy. And you believe she would actually do that? I frowned at him. I don't think that she would actually, but she made some very good points. He nodded. Only a complete idiot wouldn't accept a baker like her. Landry was a butcher and a baker. It took me years to convince him that he should focus on the baking, but when a baker has that much power, it doesn't make much sense to do something else. He got up and left the room. I followed, knowing that he'd take me to the building past the garage, an enormous structure that was filled with machinery. I walked into the building, the familiar smell of oil and metal relaxing to me. I followed him to the forge in the center, the red-hot flames constantly burning, the true heart of Candlestick Manor. I removed the handle from my knife and melted down the blade, working on it while pumping the bellows, my father's voice guiding my hands as I worked, until it was finished. Hours later, an unblemished blade that I had to reattach the handle to. I sighed and turned the knife, admiring it in the flickering firelight. Do you want to do another? I have a whole bucket of knives that need to be repaired. Surprisingly, I did. I'd stopped thinking while I pumped the bellows and worked the metal. If I enjoyed this work my father had taught me as a child, as often as he could wrestle me down to learn it, I probably really was transitioning into a CM. I was too young, but if Armand had been transitioning before he abandoned us, then this area needed another CM and had for some time. I worked through the knives and short swords until I was coated in sweat. The next time I came, I'd have to pull my hair back. By the time I was finished with the weapons, I'd done some good non-thinking as well. My thoughts had organized themselves while I hadn't been looking at them, and I had an idea of what we had to do first and where we had to go to make certain that this life we lived was protected. I went to the dungeon to talk to Anthony. He was doing well, happy enough. Even though he didn't understand why he was in a dungeon, I ignored his insults. They didn't even bother me. I was just happy that he wasn't destroyed by the monster. Could have been Lance. It was impossible to tell by looks and build, because when they changed into something else, their bodies changed. Along with it, not just werewolves but vampires became leaner, more graceful, and elongated, while werewolves went the opposite way, growing thicker, heavier, although Armand was probably still the same height if he didn't slouch. As for looks, a vampire could control what you saw when you looked at, so I couldn't trust whatever impressions I got. At the same time, Lance was mixed in it somehow. That's why I took Olivia with me to speak to the wolves. He'd never approached her, even though she'd been wandering around the north side searching for renegades. After chatting with Anthony, drawing him out, getting a better idea where the holes in his memory were, I could tell when he'd first met the monster, been twisted into a tool to lead away Sebastian. The monster had seen his potential when I had not. Interesting. Had the monster really helped Sebastian transition? I went to see Armand. He was in a meeting at the old gas station with werewolves he was organizing, breaking them into groups that could bring more order to the mess of werewolves still flooding the city. I leaned against a wall, watching the proceedings as though I belonged there. I didn't actually feel terribly out of place. Afterwards, Armand came over to me and walked past. Without stopping to say hi, I fell in behind him. We'll need to open up a new sector in Bordertown to house your immigrants. I'll talk to the CM. We have land that runs that way. I'll send some builders to check whether renovations or building from scratch would be more feasible. Check your wolves to see what skills they have. He snorted and shot me a hard look. Butcher financed werewolf housing? How friendly of you. I smiled. You're wearing a butcher's coat. You're taking energy from a baker. I think we're on the same side, more or less. He grinned at me. How did you like Vanilla's new look? I'm going over first thing in the morning to teach her more knife fighting. She's determined to be able to stab you. Good. If she can stab me, she can keep herself safe from anything. He snorted. Not that you wouldn't let her. Did you put on a good show? I frowned at him. I don't know what you're talking about. Was it Lance? His face lost all expression. Probably. You can't be manipulated by a vampire. You could look at his face. You saw him. Was it Lance? He scowled darkly. That monster was not anything I've seen before. Whether he started out as Lance or not, I can't say. The hair is similar, but he would never allow it to get that filthy. Not even I let my grooming habits fall that far, and he was much more meticulous than I ever was. I studied him. He and Lance had been like brothers, like my father and Landry, only without the baking to hold them together. When Armand had turned, Lance had changed dramatically, furious at the world and me. I'd never taken it personally. I was angry enough to understand. Armand, you said that you turned after you had a vision. What was your vision? He shrugged. Lance wanted to be the butcher, but there were some things about him that were problems. He went to the CM, tried to get a position outside our district, but the CM refused. You know how it works. Butchers don't ask for position. That was part of his problem, his ambition. You have to want to kill monsters, protect others, but personal status? That's always been a trait of their family, currying favor, trying to lobby for power and position. The same time he's loyal to the cause, like Olivia, who would never actually become the monster like I did. But now he's a monster. He shrugged. I don't know. In the vision we went to war against each other. All brotherhood broken and the butchers with it. The streets ran with blood. Butcher against butcher. Now I'm fighting the war, and it's werewolf blood that I lose, that is spilt on my behalf, not butchers. So you saw civil war. It wasn't the greater good that I worry about. He laughed. You keep your little cream puff happy and the rest of the world will follow. I stiffened up because she wasn't my little anything. Well, she was my baker. She'd made that much perfectly clear. But what else she was, I couldn't be sure. No, I was sure. I couldn't have her, not the way that I wanted her. Armand, what do you think about playing a violin duet with Sebastian in the Cavern of Seals? He stared at me. What new madness is this? I shrugged. It's something I read while researching. Sometimes music helps to soothe the monsters while we can set out temporary seals before the next one breaks due midwinter's eve. If we can keep the next surge from happening, we'll have the time to pin down this monster before 12th night. He studied me for a long time. So you want me to go down into a hole with you and a handful of butchers to play duets while you forge temporary seals to hold back hell? I nodded. He made it sound perfectly rational. You really are loony. All right. But only if you sing. I sighed. I'll be welding. And singing. I shook my head. And singing. It'll take some time to prepare. My forging skills are a bit rusty. He gave me a look. Take your time, in fact, feel free to forget all about it. It's a terrible idea, almost as bad as chasing that butcher all over down by the river, then standing there while the vampire butcher gathered his zombies to rain down on you. I sighed. I'm going to have to talk to the vampire. Maybe she'll come with us. He stared at me, then threw back his head and laughed, a laugh I hadn't heard in years. He slapped me on the shoulder. Of course you should bring a vampire. You're the craziest kid I've ever met. You know that. I turned and left the werewolf garage, heading north with the intention of butchering for the rest of the night until morning came and I could see Violetta again. I didn't want Armand with me. I wanted a nice, calm, peaceful night, just me and monsters, but Armand followed me without asking permission. And a few minutes later Sebastian joined us. Through the rest of the night more and more butchers joined our group, and the creatures we fought were no match for our band, so I was left without much to do but watch. It definitely wasn't the therapy I'd been hoping for. I returned to Candlestick feeling anxious. It was early, the sun wasn't up and only the beginnings of dawn were rising, giving everything a cold blue cast. When I got to Candlestick, the guard stopped me before opening the gate. He came out and walked around to my door, so I rolled down my window. The baker is out running. She's on her way back 3 blocks away on the corner of Candlestick Lane and Oswald. I thanked him and nodded for him to open the gates. He did so and I drove through up the winding lane to the garage where I parked and tried to plan how best to attack Violetta so that she would take my energy. Maybe I could grab her suddenly from behind, and she'd be so frightened she'd instinctively take my energy to knock me out. No, she'd know it was me the second I touched her, wouldn't she? I sat in the car in the garage for a few minutes, breathing evenly in and out, before I exhaled and exited the car, slamming the door behind me. Couldn't force her. This was her game, and if I wanted to play I had to go by her rules. If she wanted to take hardly a drop from me I had to cope with it. Stood in the doorway of the garage and watched her run up the drive, clearly exhausted, dragging like she'd pushed herself too hard. The butchers who were with her saw me while she didn't. They came over to report the nothing that they'd seen on her run. She shouldn't be out running before the sun came up. But they'd been told not to engage directly with the baker even though she might be in danger. She didn't run a consistent path. Every morning was different, so that was something. A very small something. She would be safer running circuits around Candlestick inside the iron fence. I thanked the butchers and followed her behind the house where I got to see her practice disarming an opponent. Armand had said that he'd be here to help her, but right now in the pale dawn she crouched and spun the small knife in her hand, so insignificant and her grip completely wrong. She would be disarmed immediately using that grip. I looked around impatiently for Armand, but I didn't see him. To be honest, it was hard to see anything besides her, trying to be strong and independent, but without the slightest idea how to protect herself. She needed me to help her only for a minute, just fix her grip and then I'd leave her alone. I couldn't get too close to her or I'd forget that she wasn't every part of my life. I swallowed and straightened up before I walked confidently and loudly towards her small clearing. She whirled around and watched me come. Her first response was that of soft wide eyes and parted lips, but almost immediately she scowled at me, making her nose wrinkle adorably. Butcher, what are you doing here? I didn't answer her, only walked closer until I could touch her. I didn't barely managed to keep my hands clenched at my sides. I was about to go to the forge when I saw you working on your forms. Armand mentioned that he was going to teach you some knife fighting today. Where is he? She looked around and shrugged before facing me, crossing her arms and almost cutting herself in the process. I had to help her. I needed to keep her safe, which meant that I needed to help her defend herself. Can I help you? She scowled at me harder. That's not part of our butcher-baker thing. I shrugged. It could be. If Armand didn't teach you how to hold a knife, then maybe you should look for another teacher. I thought you said you were going somewhere. I wouldn't want to get in your way. As if her being in my way would ever be a bad thing. My heart pounded and I ached to grab her hand, fix her grip and show her that she needed me. That's very thoughtful of you, Baker. You didn't say when you would feed me or when you wanted to take my energy. In fact, we haven't worked out any details of this butcher-baker thing. She frowned at me. I have a schedule. I like schedules. I wake up, go running, come back, train for an hour, then bake for the day, then after school, before butchering, you come here or I go to Calder and we do the exchange. I nodded. I suppose that would work, but doesn't it make more sense if you take my energy right before you bake and I take your baking right before I butcher? She shook her head. You mean I take your energy in the morning and you take my baked goods in the afternoon? I shrugged. I'll be at the forge every morning after butchering until I get these seals figured out. I could help you with your knife fighting. I don't see it as a conflict of interest, do you? She stared at me. I don't want you to touch me. I swallowed and my heart ached. She didn't want me to touch her when I could barely keep my hands from her skin. I only nodded though. Of course. And only until Armand comes. I nodded and pulled out a knife, slowly so she could see me pull back my coat and take it from the holster I had on my back. A smooth draw is the first thing you need to know. You hold a knife in your hand lightly but with confidence. You're a baker, so you understand cutting things. The movement of knife fighting is different since your enemy isn't usually relaxed on a chopping board. She nodded and shifted her grip so it was a little bit better. Not perfect. But without touching her, how could I show her? I needed to touch her. Blinked and took 2 steps away from her. Somehow I'd found myself almost brushing against her Open your hand. Put the knife in your palm like this, I said, showing her. Mine. Curl your fingers one at a time, watch your index finger. You're gripping too hard, too straight. You don't want your knife to be perpendicular to your hand. I frowned at her. Are you certain that I can't touch you? Would make this much easier. She hesitated before she nodded and held her hand out to me. I needed no more invitation. Her hand was in mine as I explained the precise grip, aligning her fingers, staring at that small hand and brushing her knuckles gently. My heart pounded, but my voice stayed steady, and I explained why we hold knives this way and pulled her hand out and back in the perfect thrust, never touching anything besides that one perfect, beautiful hand. Finally I stepped away, crossing my arms. All right. On your own. She did it perfectly, and almost smiled at me before she caught herself and scowled instead. All right. I don't want to take any more of your time. We'll take your energy now. You're right about me needing some for my baking. I nodded. She stared at me. I stared back. Was she waiting for me to touch her? Maybe she wasn't sure where to grab me. I would be happy with her touching me anywhere. No, of course I wasn't. I put out my hand, pulling back my sleeve so my wrist was available, then dropped on my knee, pulling my hair back so she had access to the back of my neck. I stayed like that for a long time before her soft fingers fluttered over the skin of the back of my neck, drawing life out of me a little bit. Hardly anything at all before she pulled away. Was that all she was going to take again? I couldn't bear it. I almost grabbed her, pulling her into my arms and carrying her away somewhere, but instead she gripped my wrist and my neck firmly, almost immediately drawing energy out of me and leaving me with a growing sense of peace and rightness. As happiness and contentment rushed through me, I closed my eyes and forgot about every other thing in the world. It ended too soon, but since I wanted it to go on forever, that wasn't saying much. It had been a good 10 minutes, probably, with the change in light. When I met her eyes, they were soft again, soft like her sweet lips, curved and delicious. I cleared my throat and stood, crossing my arms instead of running my hand over the back of my neck like I could catch a residual ghost of her fingers. Excellent. Shall we do this again tomorrow? She nodded but didn't say anything. Her eyes spoke to me, an aching in them that I could so easily have smoothed away if I could forget the future, the fear. I turned abruptly and strode towards the forge. Chapter 23. Baker. I watched him leave, my heart aching so badly I thought I would die. I'd been pretending that Orion was my opponent as I practiced, so when he stepped out of the shadows of the trees and came towards me, it felt like I'd summoned him. I shook my head and practiced my grip, the thrust Orion had shown me. He couldn't stand watching me do it wrong. Well, good. I wasn't doing this for fun. I focused, and only a few minutes later Armand's hand was on my lower back, straightening my spine. Keep your shoulders down. You have so much tension in your shoulders, it's almost like you've had a stressful morning. Why's that, Vanilla? I glared at him. Did you see him? He shrugged. I didn't want to interrupt you. You looked so cozy, staring at each other and not touching. He's right about your grip being all wrong. Then why didn't you tell me? He shrugged. Keep your shoulders down. I shook my head but sank down and straightened my spine, lowered my shoulders, and kept my grip from shifting into the wrong position again. All of that was hard enough to keep straight, much less the different jabs, thrusts, and swipes Armand taught me. Then he took out his own knife and attacked me. I was supposed to block him, which I managed most of the time. After sparring with Armand, touching him when I couldn't touch Orion, I headed inside, filled with Orion's energy and determined to make something truly amazing. He would be impressed and glad that I was his baker. Sadly, the soufflé didn't agree. It fell, the muffins burned, the croissants wouldn't roll out, and everything went wrong. Landry wouldn't tell me what to do because I was supposed to follow my instincts, or maybe he wasn't talking to me because I'd been so rude about him being my father. I really had been. He treated me very well, and I'd just thrown it all back in his face when he'd clearly been trying. I wanted to throw everything I'd made away, but Landry stopped me. Why? Why keep these disgusting things? I'm supposed to be great, to have talent, but I can't even make a soufflé. I can't do anything but burn muffins. Who does that? They're the easiest thing in the world. Why won't my croissants roll out? They're just a sticky mess. He sighed and stared at me. I took a deep breath and straightened up. I was Cesario, not Violetta. Wasn't going to cry over burned muffins. I'm sorry. I could use more direction, Landry. I don't think my instincts can compensate for my lack of knowledge. He picked up a muffin and sniffed it. You've made some interesting things lately. Puffer sent over the biscuits you made there, the truly horrible ones. I winced. Those were practice biscuits. He shook his head. They brought a butcher who was mad back to sanity. Orion asked for them because he knew that you would bake precisely what he needed. He would have suffered a great deal if that particular butcher had been lost. He's responsible, and he needs you to hold the world together. I stared at him. There was no way those terrible biscuits were worth anything. I picked up a muffin and sniffed it. You're saying that there's some benefit to having burned muffins over regular ones. He smiled suddenly. I'm saying that the emotion you pour into your baking gives it potency and sometimes makes you forget to keep things from burning. But I can see that you're frustrated. I will teach you the croissant tomorrow, and the soufflé the following day. I exhaled in relief. Thank you, Landry. Also, thanks for looking out for me. He looked at me for a long time before he shook his head. Not at all. Cesario. That afternoon I got a ride to Calder in the delivery truck that collected goods from all the surrounding bakers for the boys' school for up-and-coming butchers. It was guarded by several butchers in other cars, which seemed like overkill for bread, but whatever. I went down to the box, Rosine the bow, and played for Orion while he did his paperwork, a basket of burned muffins and flat soufflés at his elbow. I wanted to watch him eat, but maybe it wasn't good enough. Finally I put down the violin and stalked out, leaving him before I yelled at him, demanding that he love me. The days passed, flurries of snow kissing the air, so I wore a headband to keep my ears warm when I went running, butchers accompanying me, lucky souls. Orion came by and helped with my knife fighting, but he was strictly business. And to be perfectly honest, much better than Armand. Sometimes he asked to touch me to show me something, but most of the time he kept his distance. He was so careful to keep his distance. It was good, even if it broke my heart. I fell into being Cesario, staying busy, working on my gymnastics in the evenings when I wasn't asked to help with dinners. Thanksgiving wasn't a big deal. The CM invited me to join him, Landry and Orion, for dinner, but I was going to the Vespetis. Landry may have looked hurt, but I didn't want to deal with that. He was getting better at being strict, making certain that I had my technique right, and letting me fail until I figured it out, which included having me grind up strange and disgusting things. I couldn't kill anything, though. Landry shrugged, because what else were butchers for? He smiled at me and I couldn't help smiling back, only for a second before I turned away, focusing on cutting the carrots into identical squares. There was so much to learn, and while Landry let me flounder about half the time, the other half he did an amazing job making certain that I knew what I was doing. So, I got better through November and into December, the world going dark and still, at least as far as my world was concerned. Armand showed up in the morning with cuts, and Orion, while he never seemed to have injuries, certainly was doing something in the forge. One morning after Armand left, I wandered that direction, the building past the garage surrounded by thick woods, the clash of metal going on and on and on. I crept inside the dark interior and moved towards the center where an enormous furnace blazed, Orion working in front of it, hammering a disc of copper. He wasn't wearing a shirt, and his muscles bunched and stretched as the hammer flew. His hair pulled back and his eyes narrowed in focus as he worked. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. He lifted the heavy hammer easily for hours, pounding and rolling until his skin gleamed and glistened with sweat. I took my breakfast there most mornings after that, sitting in the shadows while I watched him, the sight of him more satisfying than a million calories. I shouldn't have done it. It did no good to drool over his perfection, but I allowed myself that one weakness. It was like keeping Oreos in the freezer. When my mother was on a diet, you eat an Oreo, you don't binge on 15 eclairs. When I got back the day after Thanksgiving, there was a whole set of men's equipment in the gymnasium, the bars, the rings, all of that. When I asked Landry, he said that he had no idea. Okay, I wore men's gymnastics clothing when I worked out in the evenings, adapting to rings and pommel horse, although I really lacked the upper body for it. Still, it was fun to have something besides floor to keep me busy. My knife skills were getting better, and sometimes I practiced positions and lunges in the kitchen while waiting for something to rise. Landry would adjust this and that or nod, but not say much. He didn't talk hardly at all after Thanksgiving, when I had the urge to make a cookie advent calendar like my Mother would do every year. Sebastian would like that. Maybe. He hadn't loved going to the Vespedes for Thanksgiving. He kept checking his phone in case Orion had some urgent business for him. I built an elaborate gingerbread house with 25 boxes and then made 25 tiny gingerbread boxes filled with candies and cookies with icing numbers, basically destroying Landry's kitchen for half a week, but when it was finished it was really cool and massive and would look kind of awesome in the main hall. I glanced at Landry, who studied my structure with his head cocked. Not bad. Love. Not bad at all. I felt a pang because he hadn't called me love since I'd found out he was my father. I brushed my hands on my apron. I thought we could put it in the front hall. Maybe that's too cute. He turned to look at me, eyebrow raised. Cesario, there is nothing cute about a 3-foot-high gingerbread structure fully self-supported with impeccable engineering. I think it could withstand the apocalypse, which is convenient, considering how things have been going lately. I frowned at him. What's been going on? He shrugged. You should talk to your butcher. I snorted. Orion's made it clear that the less time he spends with me, the better. He studied me for a long time. You're afraid that he'll reject you, and yet you still maintain an enviable connection. Not that I envy it. I have enough connection to last me an eternity. I studied him, scraping my nail on the table to loosen a bit of gingerbread. Why don't you like the connection with the CM? He sighed and shook his head. It's your origin story. I don't think you want to hear about it. I swallowed and then shrugged. I don't mind. You don't. I smiled slightly. No. He took a deep breath and sat down, studying the gingerbread advent like it would collapse otherwise. Your mother comes from down south, but she wanted a change of scenery, to get away from a butcher who she'd spent some time with, but decided she didn't like as much as she thought she did. When she came here, she already was a little bit leery of butchers. As my intern, I noticed the butchers, the way they treated her, the way she had to deal with it. Nothing horrible, but still irritating for her. She was very beautiful, very talented, and very sweet. She didn't like knifing butchers who got out of line. Got out of line, what does that mean? The Greek warned me about butchers, but everyone's been perfectly decent, other than Casper, who flirts too much, but I haven't seen him since. I stared at him and he nodded. There aren't any second chances. Casper was seen touching you without your permission after you explicitly told him to take his hand off. He won't be coming around for a long time. The CM is much more careful now than he used to be. He assumed that all bakers were like me, but while a good lot of us are nasty sots, some aren't. Your mother was one of those gentle souls. Like me. He smiled slightly. Your knife skills are coming along nicely, but I'm not sure you'd actually be able to stab one of them. Then again, you fought off Voltaire the vampire, didn't freeze up and didn't flinch away from what you had to do. I sighed. Toothpicks. Armand brings that up when he likes to be annoying, which is all the time. He laughed. He appreciates absurdity. At any rate, Laurel came here and for a while things went well enough, me taking her under my wing, so to speak, making certain the butchers knew she wasn't unprotected, that sort of thing. Nothing romantic, mind you, but then the Mistress Harmony decided it was time to have another child. He sighed and I shifted uneasily. How many details was this story going to have? Laurel was an excellent baker. Her technique was solid, but she added something to it, a warmth and gentleness that would be perfect trying to get the mistress to conceive. Unfortunately, it also got into my head. I stared at him. You ate my mother's baking? He shook his head firmly. No. I was baking for Daughtry, she was baking for the mistress under my supervision, but the spices were in the air, the scent of vanilla and sugar dripping off everything. I should never have allowed myself to fall for my intern. It was my place to protect her from those who would take advantage of her, but instead I lost myself to my butcher instincts. He shook his head and his shoulders slumped down. So the two of you had a one-night stand drunk on Conception spices? He blinked at me. No. We were together until she left for a different internship, one she'd scheduled before all of this, for hours west of here. Together, like she was your girlfriend? He shrugged uncomfortably. We didn't talk about what we were, but she stayed in my cottage every night. I frowned at him. Oh, so it wasn't a momentary lapse on your part, you were serious about her. He hesitated, then nodded. I was very serious about her. How could I not be? She was lovely. I was afraid to lose her, but I didn't want to pressure her. I'm afraid that means I wasn't very clear about how I felt. We left on good terms, but with a sort of open if things happen to work out feeling. And they didn't. He shook his head. No. She came back very angry. She'd been physically attacked by a butcher. When she reported to the CM, he didn't believe her. She demanded that I leave the CM and the entire butcher's world to be with her. And I refused. He ran a hand through his hair. I didn't know she was pregnant. I didn't know about the attack or the CM. I should have known that. There was something, she was so unlike herself, fierce and protective of her unborn children, of course. It seems obvious in retrospect, but at the time I refused. He got up and went to the sink for a glass of water. He drank the whole thing without taking a breath and thumped it down on the counter, like he just chugged something alcoholic, but of course not. He came back over and sat down, looking tired. I heard that she was marrying Joey Tancetta around the same time the CM finished his investigation of the butcher who attacked your mother. That's when I found out about that, because other bakers came forward, testified about his character, and while he'd never assaulted the men the way he had your mother, he treated them badly enough that her story became more than plausible. I was furious. The CM shouldn't have kept that from me, but he didn't know that your mother and I were ever intimately involved. At any rate, I spent a few months agonizing about what to do. I hope you didn't inherit that from me. It's a nuisance. What I heard was that Joey Tancetta and Laurel had twin babies. First of all, Joey Tancetta had an injury that kept him from having children, and secondly, twins 9 months after I was with her. I'm a twin, in case you didn't know. By the look on your face, you didn't. My sister is insane, but she bakes well enough. The Mistress Harmony keeps her with her. Make sure she doesn't wander around sucking the life out of butchers who catch her eye. Yeah, not all bakers are soft and sweet. Where was I? I went to see Laurel after the two of you were born, but what could I say? I'd refused to be with her when she'd given me the chance. Even if I had no idea about anything, I'd still chosen the butchers over her. To be honest, I don't think I could have raised you as well as Joey. Good man. Good butcher. He had solid energy she could take, but what would I do without the CM? I go as crazy as Rose. I need energy, lots of it, like you, Violetta. You can make do with a variety of butchers, but you need a solid connection with your butcher or you start feeling it. He shrugged helplessly. It's what we are. I swallowed. Did you love her? He exhaled in a rush. Yes. She made me promise to stay away from her, you and your brother, but your dad had pity on me. He'd tell me how you were doing and give me pictures. I respected her desire to keep the two of you out of this world, but I was very glad to see you in my kitchen and happy that you found Orion, someone who could protect you the way I couldn't protect your mother. It took a minute to clear the lump in my throat. I just wanted to put my head down and cry, but that was what a soft and delicate baker would do. Couldn't afford to be that person, not when that would lead me straight into Orion's arms, because his strong chest was the one I needed to cry on. So you didn't not want us? He sighed heavily. Violetta. Cesario. His mouth quirked. That your mother gave you my name was a bit confusing. I'd never intended to have children. My lines are a messy mix of baker and butcher. My father loved seducing pretty butchers, wasn't happy if he didn't have rows of bite marks on his arms. He shook his head, irritated. Your brother's transition was horrifying to witness. I baked for him every day. He was at Calder trying to find something to help, but I wasn't allowed to touch him. I wasn't either. He shook his head. I'm a very good baker. With connection, I'm fairly certain that I could have helped him, but we'll never know. I tried once, stopped him in school to shake his hand, and he shook his head. It didn't go well. Such delicate energy. I stared at him. Oh, so you tried? He shrugged. Badly. I went to a few of your gymnastics meets. I felt suddenly uncomfortable but weird. Like he'd known who I was and wanted to connect, but hadn't been able to do anything other than stalk us. How did I do? He grinned. Fierce. For a minute I wondered if you'd transition into a butcher. Your mum saw me at the last one, made a personal visit to Candlestick. The next morning. He licked his lips. It hurt her to be there. It hurt her to see me. I didn't want to hurt her, so I stopped. I still watch women's gymnastics on TV. Great sport. I hope you don't mind the men's equipment. We had that in storage so the CM thought you'd like it, but you're not really. I smiled and patted his hand. I let my hand stay there for a second longer. Before I pulled away. I'll make it work. It helps me to be Cesario to be more like you than my mother. With Orion. I looked at him but he only stared. Back waiting. He told me that he loved me the same day he told me he didn't want to see me again. I can't get over that. I really believed him. Men are so fickle and cruel, cold and idiotic. He nodded. Men are a cold-hearted lot to be sure. You're better off without them. Except that you need a butcher, but it could always be a woman. Olivia's got solid energy. I laughed. I don't think so. Olivia hates me taking her energy. He raised an eyebrow. Does she now? Well, there are a lot of other butchers. To be honest, none of them will be as good as Orion for energy. And as for connection, you'll never have a deeper one. He sighed. No, for these days of darkness, Orion needs you. You'd better wait to shop for a new butcher in the spring. My heart ached at the thought of it. Yeah. Shall we move this thing now or should we ask the CM for permission? He stood up. Let's surprise him. In other words, I don't ask the CM's permission for anything. If I need something, I tell him and he gets it for me. And if he needs something, you make it for him. He shrugged and smiled. Yeah, but I don't focus on that part. See, daughtries come from this long line of CMs who have been building wealth and power for generations. My family isn't so notable. For a long time I was self-conscious about living in Daughtry's house, eating his food so to speak. We were mates in England when he came out to train, but this is different. Making a place of your own as a baker can be complicated. There's no real job security. If your butcher dies, you're out of a job and you only get paid whatever you work out. Between the two of you, most butchers do have money, what with connections up high and free college and fancy elite schools, but with my dad dragging me around Europe, and my mother mortified that she'd ever had an affair with a baker, I've never really had a home before. He slid the gingerbread advent calendar onto a thin pan without an edge and we lifted it, carrying it up the steps and through the door down the stone hall. Past various butchers who watched then followed like we were in a procession. Bring the table, butcher, Landry commanded imperiously. A butcher leapt to take the ferny plant off the hall table and carried it after us towards the entry. Once it was arranged, set in the center beneath the enormous chandelier with real candles, I nodded in satisfaction and headed back to the kitchen. Sebastian would like it and maybe Orion would as well. Chapter 24. Butcher. Did you see the advent calendar? My mom would make one every year. Not like that though. Hers were always tiny. Violetta asked me what's going on with the butchers. Why isn't she talking to you? Don't you guys have things figured out? I glanced at him over the papers I had spread in front of me, the symbols around the edges based on mathematics and solar positions of the stars as a design for the temporary seals. I didn't know how much was the symbols and how much was the energy I put into it, but hopefully it would work well enough and I could study them afterwards to see how I could improve the permanent ones. It's very impressive and tempting. I believe that Landry has put out a kill order on anyone who takes anything before the appropriate day. At Candlestick. Christmas is a wonderful holiday, but it isn't one of the essential dates. All Hallows Eve, Midwinter's Night, and of course 12th Night, Sebastian said, frowning at his own papers. He was doing my butcher paperwork for me, with very few questions. I still glanced through them, but that was all. I seemed to need to play my part. I suppose you wouldn't have 12th Night if you didn't have Christmas, I mused. Sebastian looked up at me, his pale green eyes so close to hers but holding nothing like the same emotion, the same beauty and desirability. And about butcher business, about your relationship. I inhaled with my jaw clenched. Our relationship was one of perfect professionalism. I pretended that I didn't notice her eating breakfast in the shadows of the forge, and she pretended that her hands weren't shaking when she pulled my energy out of me. I grabbed a butcher's boy and dragged him across a hall and held him against a wall when I saw him almost touch that strange and marvelous confection. She put it there where everyone could see it and no one could touch it instead of giving it to me. Every time I passed it, I was reminded that Violetta was someone whom I could only look at as Cesario, never touch and never taste. There's not much to tell. Sure there is. Just because she's not talking doesn't mean there isn't. Anything to say. Vi can get mad and hold a grudge, but just tell her you're sorry. She's a softie once you admit how wrong and idiotic you were. I glared at my paper as I carefully measured from the edge of my circle to the symbols. I don't want her soft. I couldn't have her as my baker if she tempted me with her softness. I'm already far too tempted by her in men's clothes and that ridiculous hat. He sighed. I didn't think she'd keep it up this long. I didn't think you'd be able to keep things so impersonal. You told her you loved her. She believed you. You don't just tell someone you love them and then break up with them the same day. What if you've seriously permanently messed her up? I miss my sister Orion. We went to Thanksgiving together at the Vespedes and I thought she'd take off her butcher's clothes. You know what she wore? A suit. My old one from Calder and her black hat. No one thinks this is weird. No one said anything about it, even my Aunt Lottie. The only one she really talks to anymore is Armand. She calls me your puppy. Fetch my slippers, I said absently, as though I weren't paying attention to every single detail. I'd expected her at Thanksgiving dinner. I'd been looking forward to it far more than I would ever admit. Landry was her father, surely. She'd spend the holiday with him and I'd watch her eat and maybe we'd have conversation about something other than how to hold a knife. I'd gone to the forge halfway through and pounded on metal for hours and hours until I couldn't hold my arms up. She didn't take my energy the next day or the next. But when she did, she didn't even look at me, kept her hat low so I couldn't see her eyes. He threw down his papers and stood, his height and bulk impressive in the low black velvet box. He crossed his arms and glared at me, an old scowl that almost made me smile out of nostalgia. I don't mind doing whatever you need me to do, even to fetching your slippers or anything else, but I'm not going to stand and watch you mess with my sister. I stayed on the couch analyzing how much of a mess we'd make if I fought him. In that room. Too much. Sebastian, I'm not messing with her. I was, but I stopped. His scowl darkened. So you were messing with her? You didn't really love her. He grabbed my shirt and hauled me up, his face inches from mine, eyes bright and a little bit hungry. Butchers were so violent. If you wrinkle a single paper, I will have you ripped limb from limb. Phew. Need to exert yourself, why don't we adjourn to the courtyard? Fine. He pushed me back and whirled around to head out, up the stairs. Quickly so he didn't change his mind. I smoothed my shirt and closed my eyes for a moment, trying to get myself under control. Sebastian had no idea what he was dealing with, and to be perfectly honest, neither did I. Every night I went butchering I technically led, but the darkness focused on him rather than me, and because of that, I watched more than I worked. The thing about watching is you notice things you've never seen before, and think thoughts you'd never had before. Watching Sebastian fight, I knew every one of his weaknesses, every one of his tendencies, and knew exactly how this fight would go, at least his end. I had to decide how long I wanted this to last, how humiliated he should be, or whether I shouldn't let him win. He was right, I had told Violetta I loved her. The same day I told her that we couldn't be together. And she told Sebastian. I should suffer for that. I should suffer for ever letting things become so physical between us. I was the butcher. I knew better. I took off my shirt as I walked because otherwise I was going to let it get very bloody. I walked through Calder and then stopped walking when I saw her standing there, her mouth in a slight O while she stared at my chest. Today isn't Thursday, I said. I knew very well that she'd been here the day before, playing her violin without talking to me as she did every Tuesday and Thursday. When she played her violin I could forget, if only for a moment, that I couldn't touch her, couldn't hold her. She held up a little gingerbread box with a white number 1 in white curling frosting on it. I brought the first day for Bis. He's here, isn't he? I gestured her down the hall. He's in the courtyard. Do you intend to deliver those to him every day? She shrugged as she walked along, still glancing at me as if she couldn't help. I should button up my shirt, but I didn't want to. I wanted to take her and her gingerbread box. I'd been planning on being so nice to Sebastian, but if he got her special baked goods I'd hurt him. I should hurt him. He couldn't challenge me without me putting him in his place, otherwise he'd feel guilty. And that would eat at him, making him less capable of a butcher. What's going on in the courtyard? I don't want to interrupt butcher business. I stopped walking and turned to her. Are you sure? Sebastian said that you We're asking questions about the details of our butchering expeditions. I don't mind discussing things with you if you're interested. She took a step away from me, then folded her arms over her chest as she looked to the side, pointedly, not at me. That's very nice of you, but could you please button your shirt? I glanced down and then up. Does it bother you to see my skin, Cesario? She glared at me, eyes bright and furious. I know the way to the courtyard, so you don't need to take me. I raised an eyebrow. But that's where I'm going. I'm catching up to Sebastian, but I had to change my shirt first. That's why it's not buttoned. I should button my shirt. I should not enjoy her discomfort, her aching desire. I should not make it more difficult to be my baker than it already was, but I'm not perfect. I stepped closer to her. It's no trouble at all, Cesario. She swallowed and held out her hand. For a moment I was certain she was going to touch me, and I would have let her know. I would have pulled her into my arms against my chest and not let her go until I was unconscious. Instead she stood there, and I realized that she was offering me the little gingerbread box. Could you give this to him for me? Tell him he gets the first day, but the rest are for whoever gets to them first. Since I live there, it'll probably be me. I carefully took it without touching her skin. I smiled at her and began buttoning my shirt. I'll give him his just desserts. If you're sure you wouldn't like to come with me. She backed off, then turned abruptly and strode back the way she'd come. Watched her until she was out of sight, then nibbled on the gingerbread. Perfect. I ate one side of the box and took out the small candy that looked like a lopsided marble of gold and blue. I put it in my pocket for later while I finished eating the gingerbread box. By the time I was in the courtyard, I felt almost good. What took you so long? Sebastian asked, clearly having stalked around and lost some of his indignation. Cesario brought you the first day of her advent calendar. I ate it. You should probably beat me up very badly for that. I grinned at him, but I left my shirt on. He frowned at me. Why did you eat it? That's messing with tradition. I raised an eyebrow. Tradition? Sure. Mom made the advent, and every morning Vi and I would race to see who got it first, but one year I was too sick to get out of bed and she brought them to me, so every year afterwards she let me have the first one, even though the rest were up for grabs. I shrugged. You aren't sick anymore. No, but it's tradition. My tradition is to have a father who's a CM and a mother who's a butcher. We don't do advents or caroling, Christmas trees, or brightly wrapped presents. He frowned at me. What do you do? I smiled as I rolled up my sleeves. Why don't I show you? I humiliated him, ruined his shirt, and taught him at least 5 ways he could improve if he was paying attention. Afterwards I unrolled my shirt sleeves and headed through the groups of butchers who had gathered to watch Sebastian's humiliation. He fell in behind me, more jaunty in his steps. He'd needed to defend his sister, and now he felt like he had without actually hurting me. Butcher, why did you take it? He asked we as drove towards the city to the north side. She bakes for you every day. But she put love and affection in that. So you are hungry for her love. I glanced at him and shook my head, staring out the windshield. As hungry as an ocean, endless in my aching. Would it be so bad to be with her? You tell me, Sebastian. If I were with her, we would continue the daughtry line and our children would struggle through transition like you struggled. He frowned at me. I struggled because it's what I wanted. You don't just say no to having kids, living life because it's going to be hard for somebody. You think I'd rather my mom didn't have me just because it would be hard for me to transition? That's idiotic. Even if I had died, at least I got the chance. You take away life, you take away the chance for anything. He shook his head and stared out the window. I think it was worse for Mom than it was for me. Guess it's good that you want to save Vi from that. His reaction was different than I'd expected. It made me think which was good. Because I didn't do anything else on our hunting expedition. Sebastian was trying to prove that in spite of my lesson, he was worthy to be my butcher's boy. I didn't have a chance to even get my knife out. Even Armand complained, standing there while Sebastian whirled around in an impressive spray of gore. Why did I bother coming out? He's very enthusiastic. Has a nice shiner. Did he challenge you? I shrugged. Not really, just felt like he needed to defend his sisters. Honor. He raised his eyebrows, looking interested. What did you do to her honor? Anything interesting? I gave him a hard glare. Cesario is my baker. Sebastian doesn't like that. I hurt her before I realized that it wouldn't work. He snorted. Took him long enough to get upset about it. I believe he was waiting for things to resolve themselves. He glanced over at me. You smell like gingerbread. I taste like it too. Don't tell me that you're going to keep the advent for yourself. I shrug. She's still baking for you. He scratched his cheek. She is. To be honest, I'm disappointed that your puppy didn't hurt you. You shouldn't have told her that you loved her. I shouldn't have done a lot of things. Stubborn, he muttered. I glared at him. It comes with the territory. He grinned at me. Yes, so does fighting for her. He punched me. Hard, and for a moment I couldn't breathe, but that didn't stop me from punching back and dodging away from his next blow. He didn't fight like a werewolf, at least not usually, but every once in a while he'd lunge forward and try to take a chunk out of me. I fought easily, relaxed, but the longer he pushed me, the more angry I got. Was trying to save her. I was trying to do everything to keep her safe and away from me when everything about me ached for her, needed her, wanted to do nothing other than adore her for the rest of my life. The angrier I got, the harder I hit him until I punched him and broke his jaw, the sound of crunching bones loud in the strangely silent air. I looked around me and saw Sebastian watching me with awe mixed with worry. When I looked at Armand, he was a very ugly werewolf with one ripped ear and his face discolored. I stepped away from him, fists clenched. Couldn't entirely recall doing that amount of damage. My own shirt wasn't so much as wrinkled. Was it the gingerbread? Armand, you're so ugly your mother couldn't love you. He grinned back in spite of his lopsided jaw. Convenient that she stopped loving me a long time ago. You fight like a CM, all liquid metal and burning flame. I swallowed. Looks like it. I probably shouldn't get angry. He stopped smiling. Watching the two of you hurt is only amusing up to a certain point. Now it's just sad. Speaking of mother, she's coming next week. I stared at him and then sheathed the knife I found in my hand. Why so soon? Before Christmas. Do you want me to guess? Yours is as good as mine since you know what she talks about when she comes to visit. I haven't talked to her in years. I headed away from him towards the car. I'd had enough for one night. Needed to see Violetta. My mother would talk about when I was going to marry Olivia. She would talk about how to be just and kind, fair and selfless. She would talk about the importance that I lead by example, that I define self-sacrifice, self-control, self-denial. She would meet Violetta. That made me tremble. If she saw how I felt, she would rip Violetta apart. Not physically, but logically, rationally, emotionally. It would be fine. My mother disliked Landry and didn't spend much time in the kitchen. I'd been fooled by Violetta for a little while. Maybe my mother wouldn't notice that she was a woman. I didn't go to bed, instead heading to Candlestick where I stole the next day's advent. It was technically after midnight and I couldn't resist. Afterwards, I headed to the forge to work on my new design until it was time to knife fight with Cesario. She didn't look at me directly and had a hard time focusing at first. My shirt was buttoned, so I didn't know what it was. My mother is coming next week. She looked up at me, her eyes enormous and exquisite. Oh, that's nice. I shook my head. It's not nice. If she finds out that we were ever more than butcher and baker, if she knew that you were a woman and simply butcher and baker, she wouldn't be happy. Do we care whether or not she's happy? I studied her. Her face was closed off, distant. This was going to hurt her. But less than my mother. I do. She nodded briskly. I'll do my best to stay out of her way, and when I can't, I'll be the perfect gentleman. She lunged towards me in a flurry of sweeps that a lesser butcher wouldn't have been able to keep up with. That had hurt her. Maybe you'd be better off staying with the Vespettis until she leaves. She studied me. That would interfere with my internship. Surely her happiness isn't that important. I hesitated before I sighed. It's not her happiness that's at stake. I'd hate for you to be uncomfortable. It's always difficult when someone who you've worked hard to convince that you're perfect sees the flaws and weaknesses. Don't worry, butcher. I'll put on a convincing show. Chapter 25. Baker. I was a nervous wreck the next week, and none of the butchers ever gave me the chance to have any of the advent treats no matter how early I got up. Grumbled to Landry and he only shook his head at me. You've been grumpy for days. Are you one of those people who hates Christmas? I glared at him. And that's why I made an advent. I think the butchers are Starved for a little bit of Christmas cheer. Otherwise, why would they be so sneaky about it? I went to bed and got up at 2 in the morning, no treat. He shrugged and ducked to put a pan of rolls in the oven. I sighed heavily. What's she like? He glanced at me. Who? Orion's mom. He said that she's coming. He wants me to be a convincing boy. Maybe she won't want to see me. You're Orion's baker. She'll want to see you even though she doesn't like coming to my kitchen. I could refuse her entrance, but that would only make her more curious. I studied him. What would make her less curious? He hesitated before he grinned at me. Flirting with her. She hates when bakers do that. I stared at him. Are you kidding? I don't have the slightest idea how that would work. He nudged me with his elbow. And yet you made the fair Olivia fall for you. I was flirting with her for Orion. He shrugged. My father is the world's greatest flirt. He adores flirting with Daughtry's wife just to watch her squirm. I nodded. Okay, I'll do it. But can you show me how? He nodded. This afternoon. We'll have Olivia over for our practice. You haven't taken her energy for a long time. That afternoon when Olivia came, Landry explained it after he walked to her. Took her hand and bowed over it, kissing it before he stood and gave her a smile I'd never seen on his face before. It reminded me of Casper. How is the fair Olivia this afternoon? A breath of fresh air in this stuffy kitchen. She blushed and got all flustered even though Landry hadn't done anything terribly risque. He turned to me, his face expressionless. Like that. Olivia Cesario is going to practice flirting with you in preparation of Orion's mother's visit. She swallowed and looked terrified. When is she coming? Day after tomorrow, Landry said before he took a bite out of a pear and chewed loudly. He gestured at me to proceed with Olivia. I smiled at her, but she wasn't meeting my eyes. That wasn't going to work. Was Cesario? She was a pretty girl. I was granddaughter to a notorious flirt. Surely somewhere in my genes I could find that speck of charming rascal. Went to her and took her hand, sliding my fingers over the soft skin at least. The backs were soft, but her palms were calloused. I kissed the back, letting my lips linger as long as Landry had, and took just a bit of energy from her which made her tense up. I stood smiling. What brings a delicate flower like you to a field barren until the heavenly moment that you arrived? Landry cleared his throat. A bit much, Cesario. Maybe tone down the metaphors. Olivia shook her head. I disagree. If anything throws off Orion's mother more than being called beautiful and feminine, I don't know what it is. Landry raised an eyebrow then shrugged. All right. Now sit down, let Cesario feed off you for a bit. Olivia glanced at me but didn't pull away, and I was able to actually sink into her energy for a little while before she pulled back. After she was gone, I got a text from Chloe. She wanted to meet up at the mall. I glanced at Landry. Can I bring a friend to Candlestick, or is it strictly for butchers and bakers? He raised his eyebrows. You're welcome to bring your friends home. Of course. I nodded and called her back, taking the phone outside. This was going to be a very long conversation. I didn't explain about the butchers and bakers thing, but I did talk about men's clubs and glass ceilings and elite inner circles. So by the time I was finished, she thought they were part mafia and part Illuminati. Whatever. I was standing in the gymnasium, wrapping my wrists before I jumped up to grab the rings. I flipped upside down, staying there with my toes pointed for a long time before I flipped backwards and tucked, letting go of the rings in a perfect dismount. I could do it. I could be Cesario, male baker, if I could have ever been my brother at Calder. I didn't have a wig to cover my face, but I did have the hat. She was coming tomorrow. I fiddled with my wrists before I went to my phone and called Armand. Vanilla, are you going to run away from home? Has the Wicked Witch arrived yet? Armand, do you think that she'll buy it? He was quiet for a minute. Why do you care? I shrugged like he could see and sat down, leaning against the wall. Orion doesn't want her to know that he ever liked me. He said something vulgar. Why do you care what Orion wants? I sighed. I'm going to flirt with her outrageously. If it doesn't work, it's going to be very humiliating. He snickered. Now that's something I'd need to see, her being hit on by a female baker. If she gets in tonight or tomorrow morning, she'll probably take a tour of the kitchen mid-morning or early afternoon. Look her in the eye. You try to hide behind the hat, she'll want to know why, and she won't rest Until she sees you. Look her in the eye and wink at her. Wink at her and kiss her hand? I sighed. Anything else? He was snickering again. Be firm when you take her hand, or guide her into the kitchen. Make her promise to save a dance for you at the midwinter ball. Watch out for Rose. She's crazy. Although even if she sees through your disguise, she's unlikely to say anything about it. She'll forget or think it's a great joke. I kind of liked her. I sniffed. Okay, thanks. So that's not how it went. I was kneading bread, sure that my bust was bound very tightly, no cap on, but my hair slicked back like the Greek had shown me. I wore a cologne that wasn't too heavy, but still manly. I ignored them when they first came in, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up when I heard the woman's voice, her soft words accented charmingly. I looked up and stared at her. She was beautiful, clearly part Asian, with perfectly even features, large eyes, straight nose, and perfect mouth. Orion had her mouth. That was a strange thought, particularly considering this next part. I brushed my hands off on my pants and tried to walk over, smiling and exuding the confidence I had when I faced a panel of judges, but instead I waved my hand. Yo, I said in my Sebastian voice before I focused back on the croissants I was rolling out. I'd already put 3 batches in the oven, but I was determined to get this right. She walked over to me until she was close enough to hit with my rolling pin. Not that I'd ever do that except on accident. Accidents happened. I glanced over at Landry where he stood peeling vegetables. You're Orion's baker? Yeah. If you'll excuse me, I'm trying to focus on my croissants. The stupid things keep sticking to everything however much I chill them. I glared at Landry like it was his fault, but he only smirked slightly. Clearly was not the charming rascally type. I turned to hurry to the oven to check my croissants. They were perfect. Sighed in relief. Seeing those beautiful crescents of golden goodness made this whole thing worthwhile. Can I help you? Another voice, higher and kind of sickening sweet, asked me. This must be Rose. I turned and shrugged at the blonde angel who was a female replica of Landry. I won't learn that way. I'm Landry's lucky intern. You must be Rose, his sister. She eyed me with renewed interest. You have such stunning eyes. What's your name, Baker? Cesario, I said flatly and jerked a thumb in Landry's direction. Unloved. Spawn of the greatest baker of his time. I rolled my eyes and dodged around her to carry the pan back to the refrigerator. Orion's mother was staring at me openly when I came out of the depths of the fridge. Cesario? You're Landry's son. Landry cleared his throat. Cesario, watch your wrists. You don't roll with so much torque or you'll mess up your joints. If you're finished with your yearly tour, Mrs. Daughtry, my unloved spawn and I have work to do. She stared at him, a strange expression on her face. I didn't know that you had a son. He stared back, his expression going hard. And you think that you should know my business? Cesario, fetch me 3 grams of powdered buffalo testicles. The mistress is really going to enjoy dinner tonight. After that, I took the bread truck to Calder for my violin playing. It was stupid, but I loved it too much to stop being able to look at the back of his head for an hour, sometimes longer, but when I got to the box I heard Sebastian already playing and somebody else a duet. I wasn't sure why I felt a little bit jealous. It wasn't like playing the violin was intimate in any way, but I had to stop for a second and breathe before I could go down the stairs. When Armand saw me, he took down his violin and grinned. How did it go? Did you ask her to dance? I shook my head slightly. I choked. I fell back on my scowling impression. I am officially not a charming guy. Sebastian frowned at me. What are you talking about? Orion's mom came to check out his baker. Sebastian's eyes widened and he took a step closer. So she thinks you're a guy. If the two of you ever. That's going to be weird. The Daughtry family is good with weird, Armand said reassuringly. Why are you guys playing? I asked, all casual. It's butcher business, Sebastian said extremely seriously. I stared at him skeptically. Armand nudged him. We're not supposed to talk about it, remember? Later. Vanilla. You smell like croissants. I sighed and pulled a half a dozen out of my backpack that I gave to him. He took them and left, hurriedly, glancing back at Orion like he'd gotten away with half the hen house. Orion, if you don't need me to play the violin for you, it would be more convenient if you let me know instead of having me come all this way. He turned his head and glanced at me, something dark and delicious in that look. But I do need you to play for me. As Sebastian said, the duet is for a project we're working on. Did it have something to do with what he was building in the forge? I walked over to him, not too close, but just so I didn't have to raise my voice. What kind of project? He patted the red velvet couch beside him. I hesitated before I walked closer, but stopped behind the couch, gripping the back to keep me there instead of getting too close to where I touched him. He put a hand beside mine, less than a finger's width between them. Cesario, are you aware of the broken seals? I nodded. My idiot brother had broken one while he'd been a renegade. I have a plan to cap them with temporary seals until 12th night, when we can replace them permanently. I've been working in my father's forge. I think that the music will help. Why? He grinned. I have no idea. I have these new instincts that I have to follow. But I don't know why, and I don't know what's going to happen if I do follow them. I nodded. Instincts, I know all about following instincts that don't make any sense. Okay, I guess that explains it. What do you want me to play for you? I stepped away from him, but his hand reached out lightning fast to brush my hand before I could pull entirely away. He turned, and the movement seemed like part of his turning, nothing intentional, but my skin ached and burned and my heart pounded and twisted so hard I thought I was going to die. I took a deep breath, then another one until I could focus. He touched my hand. I should not be hyperventilating about that, but it had been so sudden, and I hadn't had the chance to brace myself for impact. I shook my head, impatient with myself, as I picked up the violin that was already warmed up, the one Armand had been playing, Orion's dead brother's violin. I stumbled out of there, having given Orion the rest of the croissants, and walked to Landry's blue car, where he stood waiting for me. I dropped into the passenger's seat and put my head back with my eyes closed. You okay, Cesario? I don't like lying to her. He was quiet for a minute. You don't have to lie. You can stay somewhere else while she's here at Calder, even with your brother, and help out the bakers. Here, you'd learn a thing or two about cooking for the masses. Stay at Calder, where I could accidentally see Orion multiple times a day. That was a terrible idea. I shrugged. It's not that big of a deal. I'm not going to really try to make her think I'm someone else. He nodded. All right. I think you did okay this morning. She'd expect my kid to be grumpy. I smiled at him. Yeah, you give the impression of not liking her much. He snorted. It's not that. All right, it's some that, but mostly she's jealous of the relationship I have with her husband. I stared at him. Wait, she thinks that you and the CM are lovers? He snorted. I don't think I'd go that far, however intense connection can be. No, it's just that he's the CM and I'm his baker, and she's his wife, but a butcher, so she lacks the capacity for feeling that the two of us have. She's envious of that. She lacks a capacity for feeling? Then she shouldn't feel jealous. He shrugged. Jealous is probably the wrong word. Excluded, maybe more apartment. I frowned at my lap, my hands twisting together. I could understand that. I'd felt jealous because Sebastian and Armand were playing violin for Orion. How much worse if someone like Landry was taking all of Orion's time and energy? She's very beautiful. He nodded. The first time I saw her, I was speechless. I actually wanted to pursue her until Daughtry told me that she was his betrothed. I raised an eyebrow. Interesting. Maybe you still have a thing for her. He snorted. No. Years of knowing Mistress Harmony, it's a lucky thing that I left her to her fate. He's a much better husband than I ever would have been. You have so much confidence in your ability to be a bad husband. His pale green eyes narrowed at the road ahead of us before we pulled up to a stoplight. It's a comfort to me. Also, she wouldn't be the sort of wife that would suit me. She wouldn't bite you often enough. He looked at me with raised eyebrows. I pride myself on never having been bitten by a butcher. It isn't something polite people talk about. I bit my lip and struggled not to touch my arm where Orion had bitten me. It's frowned upon? Definitely. Even taboo, you could say. The CM didn't make it seem that bad. That's because he'd rather have a baker for a daughter than lose his son. I flinched. Well, he's not losing his son now. He glanced at me, frowning. We'll see. What's that supposed to mean? He shook his head. It means that you have a lot of training to do if you want to be competent enough to keep up with Orion. As his baker. Let's do it.